He thought his story was already over. A 59-year-old veteran, one worn-out pickup, one German shepherd who refused to leave his side, and a rotting cabin on a mountain that looked as broken as he felt. One night, the storm hit hard. The lights went out, the wind howled, and his dog refused to stay inside, pulling him back to a single muddy spot beside the porch, digging until metal scraped under his paws. Buried there was an old box, and inside it, a letter from a man long gone that said only, "Use this to keep them safe." If you've ever asked God, "Am I still needed?" stay with this story. You might recognize his answer in an old cabin, a loyal dog, and a second chance that came far later than expected, but exactly on time. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The late autumn sky hung low over the small mountain town. A pale gray lid pressed down on the jagged ridgeline, and the rows of modest houses huddled along the main road. By late afternoon, the air already held the bite of winter. Breath showed in faint white puffs when people stepped out of doorways, and the last yellow leaves clung stubbornly to the cottonwoods along the creek, rattling whenever a thin wind slid down from the peaks. Frank Dawson clicked off the engine of the town's delivery van and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, feeling the chill seep in through the windshield and into his bones. 59 years old, medium height and a little too lean these days. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. And yet, his shoulders still carried the width and memory of a younger man who'd once spent hours under a rucksack. He wore his usual buffalo plaid shirt jacket in deep red and black, the cream-colored t-shirt showing at the neck, dark blue jeans broken in at the knees, and brown leather boots whose heels were worn a little crooked. On his left wrist, the old military watch he'd had for decades ticked on steadily, whether he paid attention to it or not. The parking lot behind the town's small warehouse was nearly empty. Most days, Frank spent his mornings and afternoons driving up and down the winding roads, dropping off groceries, prescriptions, and hardware orders to the elderly and homebound who dotted the hillsides. It wasn't glamorous work, and the pay was just enough to cover rent on his little duplex and food for himself. But it let him keep his hands busy while his mind stayed half a step behind. In the evenings, when the deliveries were done, he locked up the same warehouse he'd just unloaded from, walking its dim aisles to make sure all the doors were latched, the lights turned off, the space secure for the night. It was service of a sort. Quiet, necessary, unremarkable. That suited him. Being unremarkable felt like a kind of mercy. He slid out of the van, the cold licking at his cheeks, and stretched his back until something along his spine popped. The mountains rose dark and solid past the far edge of town, patches of early snow already shining in hollows where the sun didn't reach much anymore. For a moment he just stood there and listened. The distant hiss of tires on the highway, a dog barking 2 streets over, the metallic jingle of the flagpole rope at the post office a block away. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary place. He told himself that was all he wanted, all he deserved. Inside the warehouse, the concrete floor held onto the day's chill. Frank walked the familiar route, checked the back door, checked the roll-up side door, flicked switches to darken one row of shelves after another. He moved automatically, but the shadows pooling between the pallets sometimes folded into other shapes in his mind. Corridors half filled with smoke, the echo of shouted commands, the dry thunder of distant explosions. He blinked them away, tightening his jaw. It had been years since that particular night in the desert. The mission that went wrong. The young medic whose name he still couldn't say aloud without his throat closing. Years since his younger brother had slammed a door in his face and told him that whatever came back from the war wasn't the man who'd left. Time had stretched and thinned those memories, but it had not erased them. They rode along with him, like extra weight in the truck bed. He locked the last door and stepped out into the fading daylight, pocketing the keys. That was when he saw the mail carrier walking up the alley toward him, shoulders hunched against the wind. She was in her late 30s, compact and sturdy, with a round face chapped pink by the cold and light brown hair twisted into a messy bun under her navy cap. Her name was Rachel. She knew everyone's names in town, and she had a way of delivering small talk the same way she delivered letters, cheerfully, efficiently, never lingering longer than the job allowed. "Evening, Frank," she called, one gloved hand already digging into her satchel. "Caught you just in time." He waited by the door, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. "Evening. Didn't think I had anything coming." "So did I," she said with a quick grin. "Until this showed up in the hold for address verification bin. Been trying to track you down all week." She pulled out a large, thick envelope, the kind with reinforced corners and a strip of red along the top, official looking even from a distance. His name and the town's post office box were neatly typed in black. The return address some law firm from a city he hadn't set foot in since he'd worn a uniform every day. Rachel eyed the envelope, then him, curiosity flickering, but politely contained. "Looks important," she said lightly. "Guess somebody out there knows where you live after all." "Guess so," he answered, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. He took the envelope from her, surprised by its weight, like there was more than just paper inside. The corner of it was slightly bent, as if it had been handled by several different sets of hands before finally landing here. "Well, I'll let you get to it," she added, taking a step back. "Try to stay warm, okay?" "You too," he said. And she was already heading back toward the main street, her mailbag swinging against her hip. Alone again in the alley, Frank turned the envelope over in his hands. The law firm's name meant nothing to him. Beneath it, in smaller print, was a line that caught his eye. Regarding the estate of Margaret Collins. At the sight of that last name, his mother's maiden name, something in his chest gave a small, almost imperceptible jerk. He hadn't heard anyone speak it in years. Collins belonged to a different life. A small kitchen smelling of coffee and cinnamon toast, an older woman's gentle laugh. Summer visits cut short when his parents' arguments grew too sharp. The branch of the family that had faded out of reach when he enlisted and never quite came back into focus. He considered, for a ridiculous second, shoving the envelope into his jacket and forgetting about it, letting it slip under a stack of old bills on his kitchen table and disappear into the background clutter of his life. But his name sat there on the paper, black and undeniable, tethered to a past he'd never quite made peace with. With a sigh that fogged the air, he walked back inside the warehouse office where a faint fluorescent hum still lingered. He sat at the small metal desk where he sometimes filled out delivery logs, took a pocket knife from his jeans, and slit the top of the envelope open with a careful, practiced motion. Inside there were several sheets of paper, neatly clipped together. He unfolded the first one and began to read. The words blurred for a second before settling into focus. Formal greetings, references to his full legal name, and then the sentence that pinned him in place. He was, it said, the sole beneficiary of a parcel of land and a small wooden house in the mountains, property once belonging to his mother's side of the family. People he had not seen since he was a young soldier passing through on a brief leave. The letter explained dates, locations, and legal obligations in precise language. But all he could feel was the roar of silence in his ears. A house, land, an inheritance he had never expected from relatives who had slipped out of his life without goodbye. His fingers tightened slightly on the paper, knuckles whitening. For a man who'd spent years renting anonymous rooms, treating furniture like things that never really belonged to him, the idea of owning anything as rooted as a piece of earth felt almost unreal. And yet, tucked between the lines of legal phrasing, he could already hear the scrape of responsibility. Property taxes, repairs, decisions. Choices to be made by someone who still wasn't sure he deserved a future any different from the quiet, narrow life he'd carved out here. Frank stared at the letter until the words began to swim again, then laid it flat on the desk and leaned back in the chair, the metal creaking softly beneath him. Outside, the light was nearly gone. The office window showed only his own dim reflection. A lined face, gray at the temples, brown eyes that had seen more than they ever wanted to. He lifted one hand and rubbed at the bridge of his nose, feeling a faint tremor he hoped no one else would have noticed. A gift or a headache, he murmured to the empty room, not sure which one scared him more. The watch on his wrist ticked steadily on, unbothered by legal documents or old family names, measuring out seconds in which nothing and everything seemed to have changed. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of routine he'd wrapped around himself like a blanket, a question uncurled. Did he have it in him to open up that part of his life again? Or was this just one more weight he was too tired to carry? Morning came thin and pale through the blinds, a washed-out light that made the small kitchen look even barer than usual. The mountain air had teeth. When Frank opened the back door, a draft slid in around his ankles and up under his shirt, making him shiver despite the familiar weight of the red and black plaid jacket on his shoulders. For a moment he just stood there on the worn threshold, one hand on the doorknob, feeling the reluctance in his own body like a second, quieter pulse. Then he pursed his lips and let out a long, low whistle that rose and fell in a pattern he could have done in his sleep. From the narrow porch, a shape stirred on the old mat, then unfolded itself with a lazy shake. The German shepherd stepped into view, stretching his front legs out and dipping his head before straightening. 7 years old and solidly built, he carried his age like a seasoned athlete, no longer a blur of puppy motion, but all controlled strength and easy balance. His coat was a blend of black and tan, dulled a little around the muzzle, and if you looked closely you could see a few pale lines where fur didn't grow quite right, thin scars along his flank and over one shoulder. His ears pricked toward Frank, and his dark brown eyes, clear and watchful, studied his face the way they studied every new street they walked down. This was a dog that had learned to read danger long before he learned to nap in the sun. "Morning, Ranger," Frank said quietly. His voice came out softer than it did with most humans. The dog's tail gave a measured wag, not wild, just a steady back and forth, as if to say he'd been expecting this summons. Ranger had come into Frank's life through a rescue group that specialized in retired working dogs, animals whose bodies still wanted a job even when their official careers were done. Before that, Ranger had been attached to a search and rescue unit in the mountains several states away, running into debris and bad weather while people ran out. Frank had met that unit on a volunteer training exercise after he'd left the service. And when he'd looked into the shepherd's alert, serious eyes, something had clicked into place. Here was another creature who understood what it meant to search for people who didn't always want to be found, to carry the noise of catastrophe in his bones. Now Ranger padded into the kitchen, nails ticking lightly on the linoleum, and bumped his head gently against Frank's hip as if to nudge him into motion. "Yeah, I know," Frank murmured. "We're going." He picked up the 2 canvas duffel bags he'd packed the night before. Just some clothes, a thermos, basic tools, coffee, a few things that made him feel less like a man walking into someone else's story with empty hands. One bag went into the bed of the old pickup truck waiting at the curb, the other onto the back seat. Ranger trotted out ahead of him, then paused by the passenger door and looked back expectantly. "Don't rush me," Frank said, but there was a faint curve at the corner of his mouth as he opened the door. The shepherd jumped up in one clean arc, landing on the seat with a soft huff, then sat facing forward, ears twitching as the engine came alive. As they pulled out onto the road leading out of town, Frank kept his eyes on the winding strip of asphalt, but he could feel Ranger's presence like a steady weight to his right, a reminder that at least one living being in the world had chosen to be beside him. The town thinned out quickly. Gas station, diner, hardware store. And then the road began to climb, curling along the side of the mountain. Patches of snow lay in the shadows of the pines, while the sun, such as it was, skimmed off the bare rock faces on the opposite slope. Frank's thoughts moved in sync with the turns. The letter, the unfamiliar legal phrases, the name Collins standing out like a handwritten note in the margins. He'd slept badly, drifting in and out, the ceiling above his bed blending with hazier ceilings from other places, other years. In the end, he'd told himself what he always told himself, when caught between doing nothing and doing something. A soldier checks his ground before he makes a decision. So he would go and see, look the thing in the face, then decide how to run from it, if that's what it came to. The turnoff to the property was easy to miss. The gravel lane had no sign, just a break in the roadside brush and two leaning fence posts that no longer supported anything. Frank slowed the truck and eased it onto the narrower track, the tires crunching over stones and frozen dirt. Branches scraped along the side of the truck like fingernails, leaving faint white lines in the dust. Ranger shifted his weight, nose working, gazing out the windshield as if trying to sniff the history of this place out of the cold air. The lane opened onto a clearing that might once have been a yard. Now, dead grass lay matted and patchy, and the ground dipped oddly in places, as though it had sunk and no one had bothered to lift it back up. In the center stood the cabin. It was smaller than the word house had made Frank imagine. A single-story wooden structure with a low roof that sagged in the middle like a tired back. The siding, once painted some light color, had peeled and grayed, boards warped and separating. One shutter hung crooked by a single hinge, tapping gently against the wall every time the wind gusted. From where he idled the truck, he could see gaps along the roof line where shingles were missing, leaving the underlayer exposed like bone. The whole place looked as if it had leaned quietly into disrepair, waiting for someone to either help it stand or finally give it permission to fall. On a post near what might have been the front gate, there were two notices stapled side by side, fluttering slightly. One was printed on bright paper, the color faded by sun and weather. The other on plain white. Even from the truck, Frank recognized the harsher typeface of overdue tax warnings, the formal wording of impending foreclosure. The law's way of saying, no one has come for this in time. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt heavier than the hum had. "Stay," he told Ranger out of habit as he climbed down, then reconsidered and opened the passenger door. The shepherd hopped out and shook himself, nose already angling toward the cabin. For a heartbeat, Frank thought he might make the dog sit by the truck, keep him close. But something about the way Ranger stood, alert but not tense, curious but polite, made him let it go. "All right," he said. "You can look." As they walked toward the gate, the crunch of gravel under Frank's boots synced up with the soft pad of Ranger's paws. Up close, the notices resolved into specifics. Past due amounts, deadlines, the kind of numbers that turned land into liability. He felt his jaw tighten, not at the figures themselves, but at the quietly accusatory language, as if paper could shrug and say, well, somebody let this happen. He knew that tone too well. He'd used it on himself for years. "You must be Mr. Dawson." The voice came from off to his left, smooth and practiced. Frank turned to see a man in his mid-40s walking toward him from a dark SUV parked partially behind a stand of bare aspens. The man was taller than Frank by an inch or two, with a trimmed beard that matched his neatly combed dark hair, both showing just the slightest intentional gray. His coat was a sleek charcoal wool that fit him perfectly, the kind you bought after a tailor measured your shoulders, and his shoes were the kind that didn't often see dirt roads. A leather portfolio was tucked under one arm, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected doors to open when he pushed them. "Name's Victor Hayes," the man said, extending a hand. His grip, when Frank took it, was firm but not crushing, skin warm despite the air. "I represent Alpine Ridge Development. I'm glad you came up. Saves us both some time." Ranger had stepped half a pace closer to Frank, not aggressive, just there. His ears were forward, eyes locked on Victor in that unwavering way dogs have when they're deciding who exactly they're looking at. Victor glanced at Ranger and gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "And this must be your partner," he said lightly. "Handsome fellow." "Ranger," Frank said. "He won't bother you." "I'm not bothered at all," Victor replied. "We like dogs at Alpine Ridge. Very loyal." He brushed a speck of imaginary lint from his coat sleeve, then nodded toward the cabin. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries, Mr. Dawson. You can see the situation here as well as I can. The property has been neglected for years. The county wants its money, and bringing this place up to code would cost a fortune. Fortunately, my company specializes in solving problems like this." He opened his portfolio and produced a slim stack of papers, clipped together. "We're prepared to make you a fair offer for the land as is, enough to clear the back taxes and leave you with a very comfortable sum. You could, as they say, start over. No headaches, no dealing with contractors or inspectors. Just sign, and we take it from here." The words "start over" seemed to hang in the cold air between them. Frank looked down at the papers but didn't reach for them. Over Victor's shoulder, the cabin sat quiet and crooked, every flaw on display. Ranger had drifted away from the men by a few feet, nosing along the edge of the sagging porch, pausing where the steps met the ground to sniff intently at a crack between boards, as if searching for some trace of whoever had once walked there. The dog's body was relaxed, tail low but gently moving. Yet there was a kind of intentness in the way he moved, a silent question he kept asking the old wood and the frosted ground. Frank felt another question somewhere deeper, lodged behind his ribs. If whoever had owned this place before had let it come to this, let time and weather do their slow work, let the county tack warnings to the gate, what made him think he could do any better? What made him think he had enough left in him to hold up something that even its own people had allowed to sag? He watched Ranger lift his head and look back at him, eyes dark and steady. And for a heartbeat, Frank wondered whether the dog saw ruin here or the faint outline of something worth standing next to. Frank kept his eyes on the stack of papers in Victor's hand a beat longer, then slowly shook his head. "I don't sign anything today," he said. His tone was even, not confrontational, just firm. "I need time to think. Look around." Victor's smile stayed in place, but something behind it cooled a few degrees. "Of course," he replied, tucking the contract back into the leather portfolio with a practiced motion. "Take a few days. The county's deadline is coming up, but I'm sure we can work within it. Call me when you're ready to move forward." He handed over a business card, heavy stock, clean font, a phone number under the company logo. and then stepped back toward his SUV. "Just remember," he added, his voice carrying easily across the cold air, "the longer this sits, the more it costs you. Sometimes the easiest pain to live with is the one you choose sooner." The engine of the SUV purred to life, and a moment later Victor was gone, tires sending up small bits of gravel as he drove back down the lane. In the silence that followed, Frank looked at the card in his hand, then folded it once, twice, before sliding it into his jacket pocket like something he wasn't ready to admit he'd received. Ranger stood at the base of the sagging porch steps, looking up at the cabin with his head slightly tilted, ears forward. Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "All right," he muttered. "Let's see what kind of mess they left us." The front door complained as he pushed it open, swollen in the frame, the bottom edge scraping against the warped boards. Dust motes spun in the thin light that filtered through dirty windows, hanging in the air like a slow-motion snowfall. The smell hit him first. Old wood, damp plaster, something faintly sour underneath, like forgotten food and long-settled grief. Ranger trotted in ahead of him, claws ticking on the floor, nose working in tight, thoughtful circles. The living room opened into a small kitchen at the back, where cabinets hung crooked and an ancient stove sat listing slightly, one foot propped on a scrap of wood. A table for four was shoved up against the wall, two mismatched chairs on either side. Everything wore the same film of dust, as if the place had been paused mid-breath years ago and never set back in motion. Frank ran a fingertip over a counter edge, leaving a clean line in the gray. For an instant, another kitchen surfaced in his memory, his grandmother's. All warm light and the clink of dishes, the smell of bacon and biscuits. His mother laughing as she shooed him away from the cookie tin. He swallowed the picture down before it could sharpen. Behind him, Ranger moved into a far corner of the kitchen and stopped so abruptly that one paw squeaked against a loose board. The dog stood there, body suddenly still, nose pressed toward a section of wall where the paneling looked no different from anywhere else. "What is it?" Frank asked, more out of habit than expectation. But he recognized that posture, the focused tension of a dog who'd caught the edge of something that didn't belong. Ranger sniffed again, then lifted a paw and scratched lightly at the lower part of the wall. The sound was small but distinct, not just nails on wood, but nails on wood that wasn't quite attached. Frank's brows drew together. He crossed the room, crouched down, and pressed his own fingers along the baseboard. One narrow board shifted under the pressure, the slightest give. Someone had wedged it into place, not nailed it. "Good nose," he murmured. Using the flat of his hand, he eased the board away from the wall. It came free with a reluctant squeak, revealing a shallow cavity between studs. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper that had once been white, lay a small tin box, no bigger than a man's hand. For a second, he just stared at it, feeling the odd weight of being watched by his own dog and by the empty room at the same time. Then he reached in and pulled it out. The tin was cool and a little rusty at the edges. The lid stuck for a moment, then yielded with a soft pop. Inside were several folded bills, old designs, the colors washed out with time but still recognizable, 20s and 10s, and a scrap of lined paper torn from a notebook, folded in quarters. The money made his practical mind twitch. What it might cover, what it couldn't possibly. But it was the note his fingers went to first. He unfolded it carefully. The paper felt delicate, like it might tear from being looked at too hard. The handwriting was rough, letters leaning into each other, the ink blotted in places where the pen had paused too long. "For the nephew I hope finds his way back to this house someday," it read. "I don't have much, but I don't want you to feel like you were forgotten. If you're reading this, It means you came. That's worth more than what's in this box." There was no signature, just the initials MC, the same as the name in the estate letter. His uncle. The man he remembered mostly as a tall shadow on a porch, a booming laugh, a rough hand patting his shoulder when he was a boy, in hand-me-down boots. He hadn't known there'd been any thought of him here past those summers, past the last abrupt end to visits when his father's temper had finally burned through the last bridge. Now, sitting on the worn kitchen floor with a tin box in his hands, Frank felt something loosen and tighten in his chest at the same time. Forgotten. Remembered. The two ideas had been fighting for space inside him for years, and this one small line of ink tilted the balance in a way that hurt more than he'd expected. Ranger eased closer, his warm breath brushing Frank's wrist as he sniffed the note, then the box, as if cataloging this strange artifact into his understanding of the world. Frank let his fingers rest for a moment on the dog's head, feeling the solid skull, the living weight under the fur, an anchor in a room that suddenly felt crowded with ghosts. He was still sitting there when a sound cut through the cabin's silence. A dry, rattling cough from outside, high-pitched and repeated. It wasn't the bark of a dog or the clearing of an adult throat. It had that sharp, wheezing edge that made the hairs on the back of his neck go up. He got to his feet with a stiffness that wasn't only from age and crossed to the front door, Ranger at his heel. On the patchy yard beyond the porch, a woman stood near the tree line, one hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a boy who looked to be around 8 or 9. The boy was thin, his winter jacket a size too big, the cuffs frayed, a knit hat pulled down over light brown hair that curled at the edges. He was bent slightly forward, one hand pressed to his chest as another fit of coughing shook him, the kind that seemed to scrape the air out rather than pull it in. The woman, mid-50s, narrow-shouldered, with graying hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, rubbed his back in slow circles, her own face drawn, lines etched deep around her mouth and eyes. Even from the porch, Frank could see the hollows beneath her cheekbones. The way her clothes hung a little loose, more from wear than design. He stepped down onto the top stair. "You folks all right?" he called, keeping his voice low enough not to startle but loud enough to carry. The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her features before she managed a small, wary smile. Up close, her eyes were a faded blue, tired but not unkind. "He'll be fine," she said, though her hand didn't leave the boy's back. "It's just his lungs. The cold kicks it up sometimes." The boy's coughing began to ease, each breath still coming with a faint whistle. Ranger, who had come to stand beside Frank, watched them with his usual calm intensity, tail hanging neutral, not wagging, not stiff. "I'm Frank," he said. "Just got here this morning." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "Didn't mean to intrude." The woman gave a short, breathy laugh that wasn't quite humor. "You can't intrude on something that's not yours yet," she said, then seemed to catch herself. "Sorry, that came out wrong." She shifted her weight and nudged the boy gently. "This is my grandson, Eli. I'm Linda." Eli glanced up briefly, hazel eyes peeking from beneath the brim of his hat, then down at Ranger. The dog stood very still, then slowly sat, softening his posture. After a moment, Eli extended one hand, tentative, fingers hovering just above Ranger's head. When the shepherd didn't pull away, the boy's mouth twitched into the ghost of a smile. "We live back there," Linda said, nodding toward the trees. Between the trunks, Frank could now make out the dull shape of an old trailer, its metal sides mottled with rust, propped on cinder blocks near the edge of the property. "My sister used to keep her horses on this land," she went on, We helped with the place when your uncle got sick. After he passed, the county got louder than any of us, and, well," she shrugged, a small, defeated gesture. "No one ever told us to leave. So we stayed. Close enough to town for his doctor, far enough that the neighbors don't complain when the generator rattles." Her gaze slid past him to the cabin, then to the notices on the post. "They came around a few months ago," she said quietly. "Men like the one you just had here. Told me there'd be a resort someday. Said it would bring jobs and money. I asked them where folks like us go when there's no room left for old trailers and kids who can't breathe right. They didn't have much to say to that." Frank followed her look to the papers, then back to the boy, who was now resting both hands lightly in Ranger's fur, his breathing steadier. "This place," Linda added, her voice thinning, "it's the last bit of ground that ever felt like it belonged to our family. Even if the paperwork says otherwise. If it goes, I don't know where we go." The honesty of it sat between them, bare and unadorned. There was no plea in her words, not exactly. Just a statement of fact, like the weather report or the tax notice on the post. Ranger shifted closer to Eli, leaning his solid warmth into the boy's side in a way that made the kid straighten a little, as if borrowed from the dog's steadiness. Frank felt his fingers curl involuntarily at his sides. He had come up here thinking about numbers and escape routes, about whether he could endure one more responsibility without cracking. Now the equation had new variables. A woman with tired eyes, a boy whose every breath came at a cost, a tin box in a wall that said someone had once hoped he'd walk through this door. That night, after Linda had led Eli back toward the trailer and the pale square of its window glowed weakly through the trees, Frank sat on the cabin's front step with his elbows on his knees, the cold seeping through the worn wood into his bones. Ranger lay beside him, head resting on Frank's boot, eyes half closed, but ears still tuned to every rustle in the dark. In the distance, he could hear the faint rattle of the trailer's generator, and once, the echo of a cough carried thin on the air. He looked at the notices on the post, then at the dim light that marked where Linda and Eli slept. And the question that had been theoretical earlier now pressed like a stone in his chest. If he signed that paper, would he just be selling off a piece of land? Or would he be selling away the last safe corner of the world for people who had even less room to run than he did? Morning seeped into the cabin in thin gray stripes through the gaps in the curtains, bringing with it the faint tang of smoke that still clung to the old wood, even though the fire in the hearth had died hours ago. Frank's back ached from sleeping in the crooked armchair. But when he opened his eyes and saw Ranger curled on the rug nearby, the dog's chest rising and falling in slow, steady waves, the ache felt like part of the price of being here, rather than somewhere blank and anonymous. He pushed himself to his feet, rolled his shoulders, and told himself that if he was going to decide anything about this place, he needed to see more of it than the front step and one dusty kitchen. So he started with the living room. It was a crowded little square of a room filled with mismatched furniture that looked like it had been collected one piece at a time over decades. A sagging sofa, a low coffee table with one leg shimmed by an old paperback, a bookcase leaning just enough to make him nervous. He opened the curtains, letting more light in, and dust shimmered up in the air. Ranger padded alongside him, sniffing at chair legs, the edge of the bookcase, the baseboards. Frank began the slow work of clearing, stacking brittle magazines into a box, folding moth-eaten blankets and setting them aside, moving picture frames whose glass had gone cloudy. Each object seemed to carry a faint echo of hands he'd never see again. He was stooping to lift a rolled-up rug in the middle of the floor when Ranger gave a short, sharp bark. Not loud, but urgent enough that it cut through his focus. "Easy," Frank said automatically. But he paused and watched as the dog stepped onto the rug, nose low, tail held out in that straight line that meant he'd found something that didn't match the rest of the picture. Ranger pawed once, then twice, at the edge of the rug, claws catching enough fabric to pull it back a few inches. Frank set the things in his hands down and bent to help, rolling the rug back toward the wall. Underneath, instead of more scuffed floorboards, there was a rectangle of darker wood set into the floor. Edges flush but clear. A hatch he might have missed if he hadn't been looking from just the right angle. A metal ring, dulled by years of use or non-use, sat in the center. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Good eyes, partner." Ranger's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, but his gaze stayed fixed on the hatch. Frank wrapped his fingers around the ring and pulled. The hatch lifted with a reluctant groan, stiff from disuse, and a breath of air rose up from the darkness below, cool and damp, carrying with it the smell of earth and stone, of things that had been kept out of the sun for a long time. Underneath the damp there was another smell too, sharp and metallic, and for a split second the cold air in the cabin became desert heat in his mind. The stench of wet canvas and mud and spent gunpowder, the cramped press of a trench he hadn't stood in for decades. His throat closed on an old, reflexive cough that never quite emerged. "Basement," he told himself, quietly and firmly. "Just a basement." He found a light switch on the wall near the hatch, but when he flicked it, nothing happened. So he took the flashlight from his jacket pocket, the one he'd started carrying again as soon as he knew he was coming up here, and clicked it on, sending a narrow beam down the short wooden steps into the space below. Concrete floor, low ceiling, walls lined with shelves. No bodies, no sandbags, just shadows and dust and shapes that could be anything. He descended slowly, one hand on the rail, Ranger waiting at the top like a sentry. At the bottom, his boots left prints in the thin film of grime. Cardboard boxes were stacked in lopsided towers along one wall, their sides sagging, labels faded. Old canning jars glinted faintly in the flashlight beam on a shelf, some still cloudy with forgotten preserves. In the far corner, pushed up against the wall as if someone had intended to deal with it later and then never did, sat a small wooden chest with iron hardware about the size of a carry-on suitcase. Dust lay thick on its lid, undisturbed. No sign of mice chewing, no footprints beyond his own. He knelt, his knees protesting as they met the cold concrete, and brushed the dust away. The wood underneath was scarred but solid, the iron latch stiff but unbroken. For reasons he couldn't quite name, his pulse picked up a notch as he flipped it free and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged despite the years, were bundles of envelopes tied with disintegrating string. Some were yellowed around the edges, others only a little faded. The handwriting on the first one he picked up was instantly familiar now that he'd seen it on the note in the kitchen. Blocky letters leaning forward with impatient energy, his uncle's hand. The top envelope was addressed to his parents' old house, the one they'd left when he was still a teenager. The postmark was from the year he'd come back from his last deployment. The flap was unbroken. He looked at another. Same hand, later date, different address, the rental his parents had moved to when things got tight. Another unbroken seal. Letter after letter, all addressed to his family, all never opened. His chest tightened as if someone had reached in and squeezed. He slit the first envelope carefully along its top edge and slid the paper out. The words inside were plain, clumsy in places, full of small details about the cabin, the weather, the local gossip. In between lines about a neighbor's stubborn cow and the trouble with the well pump, There were other sentences that landed like stones. I heard he's back from over there. I wrote to the base, but they said you'd moved. I keep hoping you'll bring the boy up here. Let him breathe some clean air. If he's having a hard time, it's not his fault. You know that, right? Frank's breath went shallow. He could see his father's face as he remembered it from that time. Jaw clenched, eyes hard whenever the news came on, the way his hands tightened around the remote until his knuckles went white. He pictured the mail slot, the plop of envelopes on the floor, the easy, almost casual kick that could send something smaller than a bill under a piece of furniture, out of sight. He tried, Frank said aloud before he realized the words were leaving his mouth. His voice sounded too loud in the close air. He was trying to reach us. He pulled out another letter, then another. Some mentioned a lawyer in town. The idea of signing papers to make sure the house goes where it ought to when I'm gone. One was nothing more than a single page, the handwriting more wobbly, ink blotched where the pen had paused. If I don't get to see you again, I'd like you to have this place, kid. Somewhere to put your pack down. Lord knows you've carried it long enough. By the time he reached the bottom of the chest, there were several letters splayed open around him, the stories they'd been trying to tell years too late to answer. His fingers trembled faintly, not just from the cold. Ranger had come partway down the stairs now and lay stretched out on the lowest step, chin on his paws, eyes lifted to watch Frank's face. Every so often the dog's ears shifted, attuned not to distant sounds this time, but to the rhythm of his breathing. I didn't just leave, Frank whispered, though there was no one here to accuse him but the echo of his own guilt. I got left too, and I still walked around acting like I was the only one hurt. The familiar loop from the war slid in beside this new realization. The one where he replayed the night he hadn't been fast enough to drag a bleeding corporal out of a collapsed doorway, the radio calls he hadn't made quickly enough. Different battleground, same verdict. You failed them. You failed him. You failed yourself. Upstairs, something made a small, sharp sound, like a distant tap. Frank's head jerked up. For a moment he held still, listening. A second later he caught it again, this time accompanied by the faintest hiss. His mind sorted the noises automatically, the way it had been trained to do. Not footsteps, not an animal, not the generator. Something else. The hairs on the back of his neck rose before the word formed. Gas. He snapped the lid of the chest shut, the bang echoing off concrete, and scrambled to his feet. "Ranger, up!" he barked, the command from years ago slipping out as easily as breath. The shepherd was already moving, spinning on the stair and racing up ahead of him, nails scrabbling for purchase. As Frank climbed, the smell met him halfway. A thin, sour note leaking into the air from the direction of the kitchen, so faint it might have been missed if not for the training that had taught his nose to sort one danger from another. In the main room, Ranger was no longer calm. He stood between Frank and the kitchen doorway, body rigid, ears pinned forward, barking in short, insistent bursts that bounced off the walls. I know, Frank said. But the reassurance was more for himself than the dog. He edged toward the kitchen, holding his breath, eyes scanning automatically for the source. The old stove sat where it had before, but one of the burner knobs was slightly turned, and near the far wall, above a cracked outlet where someone had once plugged in too many things, a tiny, traitorous spark flickered as a loose wire made contact. Time contracted. Every briefing he'd ever heard about fumes and ignition points ran through his brain in a single flash. He didn't think. His body simply reacted. He lunged back toward the door, grabbing the edge of Ranger's collar as he went. The dog surged with him rather than against him, helping rather than hindering, as if understanding the urgency in the way only an animal that has stood too close to disaster can. They made it through the front door and onto the yard just as a muffled whump sounded from inside, followed by the whoosh of flame catching old grease and dry wood. Heat pushed at their backs. Then a plume of black smoke rolled out through the kitchen window, which cracked with a sharp pop. Frank stumbled to a stop several yards from the porch, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake his whole frame. Ranger pressed against his leg, sides heaving, eyes fixed on the cabin as if ready to go back in if asked. "No," Frank said hoarsely, one hand finding the dog's neck and holding on. "We're staying out." They stood there together in the cold yard, watching the smoke churn and the edges of orange light flicker inside the window like some angry spirit trying to claw its way out. The front half of the cabin was still intact. This wasn't a towering inferno, not yet. But it was enough to blacken the ceiling, to peel paint, to make everything inside that much more fragile. The smell of gas was gone, burned away, replaced by scorched wood and old cooking oil. Frank's lungs burned as if he'd run a mile uphill. His mind raced through options. Dirt, water, letting it burn out. But underneath the practical calculations, another, quieter voice was asking a different question altogether. If the house itself seemed determined to fall apart around him, if just opening old boxes and old wounds brought this kind of danger down on all their heads, was he a fool to think he could fix any of it? Or would walking away now be one more kind of cowardice, another version of leaving people behind when they needed him most? The day after the kitchen fire, the mountains wore a low ring of cloud, like someone had set a gray collar around their shoulders. A damp chill clung to everything, seeping into Frank's jacket as he stood by the truck, radio murmuring on the seat behind him. He wasn't really listening until the weatherman's voice sharpened. "First big storm of the season rolling in late tomorrow," it said. "Heavy rain, strong winds, potential for localized flooding and slides in the foothills and canyons. Folks near creek beds and old washouts, take note." Frank's eyes drifted toward the tree line where the faint outline of Linda's trailer sat, half hidden. He didn't need a topographical map to know the ground dipped there. He'd seen the way snowmelt carved narrow paths down through that part of the property, the small, dry channel that cut past the trailer's back end like a sleeping snake. He reached into the truck and turned the radio off, the silence landing heavier than the forecast. Ranger stood a few feet away, nose to the wind, ears pricked. The dog sneezed once as if the air had offended him, then looked back at Frank with a quiet question in his eyes. "Yeah," Frank said under his breath. "I heard it too." The call from the development company came that afternoon. His cell phone buzzed in his pocket while he was sweeping broken glass out of the kitchen doorway, trying to clear away the worst of the damage the fire had left. The screen lit up with a number he recognized from Victor's card. He considered letting it go to voicemail, then swiped to answer. "This is Frank." "Mr. Dawson," came Victor's smooth voice, threaded with a kind of brisk concern. "I heard from the county inspector about your little incident." There was a pause just long enough to make the word sting. "Glad to know you weren't hurt." Frank glanced at the scorched frame of the kitchen window, the black smear climbing up the wall. "We're fine," he said. "House is singed, not gone." "For now," Victor replied. "But with that storm coming in, you're looking at a very different equation. Old structures like that one, roofs leak, foundations shift, trees come down on exactly the wrong spot. The sensible thing would be to get you out of there before the weather does what weather does." He let the words hang, then continued, warmer. "Look, my office pushed your paperwork to the top of the stack. If you sign before the storm hits, we can take responsibility for the cleanup, any structural issues, the whole mess. You go back to town, We deposit a nice tidy sum in your account, and you get to stop worrying. No more gas leaks, no more near misses. Just a simpler life. Through the open doorway, Frank could see Ranger lying on the porch boards, chin on his paws, watching a pair of crows argue in a bare tree. The dog's tail thumped once, slow. When he heard Frank's voice, even though he couldn't catch the words. "You'd fix it up?" Frank asked. Not because he believed the answer would change anything, but because he wanted to hear how the man phrased it. "We'd make it safe enough to be part of the resort plan," Victor said. "Or take it down and build something better in its place. Either way, not your headache. You've served your time in hard places, Mr. Dawson. You don't have to keep living like you're still on the front line." The phrase lodged somewhere behind Frank's ribs. Served your time, hard places. The man had no idea what those words meant in his mouth, but they still hit where he'd been left soft. "I'll think about it," Frank said. "Clock's ticking," Victor replied. But there was no edge in it, just that easy, practiced persuasion. "Storm's a good excuse to do the smart thing. I'll send the paperwork to your phone. A couple of taps, and this can all be behind you." When the call ended, Frank's phone chimed almost immediately with an email notification. He didn't open it. Instead, he slid the phone into his pocket and stepped out onto the porch. The sky had darkened further, the light going that odd flat color it sometimes took on before a big rain. Somewhere distant, thunder muttered like an old man talking in his sleep. Later that day, Linda came up the path with Eli trailing behind her, both of them bundled in jackets that weren't quite thick enough. Linda's hair was tucked under a knit cap, wisps of gray escaping at her temples, and there were deeper shadows under her eyes than there had been the day before. Eli clung to his inhaler with one hand, the plastic casing scuffed from use. "You hear the forecast?" she asked without preamble, rubbing her palms together as if she could scrub the worry out of them. "The creek bed back by us turns into a river if it really comes down. Last time we had a decent storm, the wheels on the trailer sunk half a foot in mud." She gave a brittle little laugh. "This old thing finally decides to float. I don't know where we'll end up." Eli had already peeled away from her side, beelining for Ranger. The dog rose to meet him, body lowering into a half bow that somehow managed to be both playful and gentle. Eli wrapped his arms around Ranger's neck, pressing his face into the dog's fur. His breathing sounded okay today, no rasp, but Frank could feel the weight of every lungful like it was his own. "We'll get you some sandbags," Frank said. "Maybe move some things to higher ground." Linda nodded, but her mouth stayed tight. "I know you don't owe us anything," she said. "This isn't our name on the deed. I just—" She glanced over his shoulder at the blackened patch of wall, then back at his face. "I just thought maybe if you were thinking about selling, you'd wait till after the storm, so we know which way we're running." The bluntness of it made something in Frank unclench. He'd spent a lifetime around people who couched their needs in orders or silence. Linda's straightforward fear felt almost like respect. "I'm not signing anything before it hits," he said. "You have my word." Some of the tension left her shoulders. "All right then," she murmured. "We'll do what we can on our end. Holler if you need an extra pair of hands." As the afternoon slid toward evening, the wind picked up, threading through the trees with a low, rising hum. A few fat drops of rain spattered the porch, darkening the wood in uneven patches. Frank brought what he could into the drier parts of the cabin, dragged a chair to the front room where the roof felt least questionable, and set a metal bucket under a spot he suspected might leak. He checked his flashlight, set spare batteries on the table, filled a couple of jugs with water, the old routine settling over him like muscle memory. Ranger followed his circuits, never underfoot, always close, occasionally nudging his hand as if to ask where they were needed next. Night came early, the clouds swallowing the last of the light. Thunder rolled closer now, an occasional flash on the far side of the ridge, painting the window frames in stark white for a heartbeat at a time. In the dim glow of a single lamp, Frank lowered himself into the creaking rocking chair near the front window. The red and black jacket draped over him like a small, familiar shield. Ranger curled at his feet, not quite asleep, eyes tracking each rumble of the sky. On the side table, his phone lay face up, screen lit with the soft, insistent glow of the open email. Contract. Signature required. One tap to scroll, another two to sign. A clean exit, or at least cleaner than any he'd been offered in a long time. His thumb hovered above the glass, the storm reflected faintly in the dark of the screen. He thought of the letters in the basement chest, inked by a hand that had believed he might someday want a place to set his pack down. He thought of Linda's voice when she said, "I don't know where we go," and of Eli's thin arms wrapped around Ranger's neck like the dog was the one solid tree in a fast river. He thought of every briefing where he'd heard the words, "Hold until everyone is clear," of nights spent in makeshift shelters while worse things than rain beat against the walls, of the faces of men who hadn't gotten out in time. The chair creaked as he leaned back and let his hand fall away from the phone. With a quick, decisive motion, he tapped the screen dark and set the device face down on the table, as if he were putting away a temptation rather than a tool. "We're staying through this one," he said quietly, more to Ranger than to himself, though he needed to hear it too. "We make sure they're all right. Then we figure out the rest." Ranger's tail brushed once against his boot, a small, steadying stroke. Outside, the wind gave a louder howl, and rain finally began in earnest, ticking against the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers. Frank stared into the shifting dark beyond the window, feeling the familiar stirring of dread in his gut, and the equally familiar, stubborn thread of resolve that always rose to meet it. And he couldn't help wondering which would prove stronger when the storm outside finally matched the one already moving through his chest. The storm came in wrong, faster and meaner than the radio voice had promised. By the time full dark settled, the rain wasn't falling so much as slamming sideways against the cabin, drumming on the patched roof in a relentless roar. Wind howled through the trees, making the walls shudder now and then with a dull, tired groan. Frank sat forward in the rocking chair, jacket pulled tight across his chest, listening to the sounds under the storm, the way he used to listen for mortar fire beneath helicopter rotors. Ranger lay on the floorboards by his boots, head up now, ears pricked so sharply they almost seemed to vibrate with each new gust. The power went out in a single, abrupt blink. 1 second the lamp was there. The next the cabin dropped into darkness so absolute it felt physical. Almost instantly, the storm seemed louder, as if the thin veil of electricity had been keeping it at arm's length and now it was pressed up against the windows. Frank didn't bother swearing. He reached for the flashlight he'd left on the table like a habit and clicked it on, its narrow beam carving out a small, obedient circle of light. "We knew that was coming," he muttered. Ranger's only answer was a low whine in his throat, not fearful, just alert. Then, beneath the wind and the rain, a different sound threaded through, a faint, distant rumble, lower than thunder, accompanied by the subtle vibration of the floor under his boots. He frowned and stood, crossing to the front window. When he shone the flashlight out, all he could see were sheets of water and the ghostly silhouettes of trees thrashing. But the rumble grew, and in it he recognized something he'd heard in other places long ago. Not machines, not planes. Water gathering speed and anger. Somewhere out there, The dry creek bed that snaked along the property had woken up. Ranger suddenly stiffened, head snapping toward the door. A growl started deep in his chest, then broke into sharp, urgent barks. He scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the door, looking back at Frank, tail high, barking now not at the storm in general, but in one clear direction, toward the line of trees where the trailer sat. All right, Frank said, even as his body was already moving. The adrenaline hit him like it always had, hot and cold at the same time, making the edges of his vision tighten and sharpen. He shrugged into the red and black jacket, grabbed the flashlight and the length of tow rope he'd left coiled by the door, and yanked his boots on properly. "Stay close," he told Ranger, though they both knew the dog would be a step ahead. When he opened the door, the storm reached in and grabbed him by the throat. Rain slapped his face, soaking his hair in seconds. The wind tried to shove him backward into the house. He hunched his shoulders, ducked his head, and pushed out onto the porch. Ranger bounded down the steps into the deluge, his coat darkened to near black, ears flattened. Against the onslaught, barking over his shoulder as if to say, "Now!" Frank followed the dog's dark shape, the flashlight beam jittering over mud, grass, and water as he fought his way toward the tree line. The creek that had been a shallow cut in the earth the day before was now a churning coffee-colored torrent, swollen up out of its banks, licking hungrily at the edge of the clearing where Linda's trailer stood, or rather, leaned. One side was already sagging, the downhill wheels half buried as water chewed away the soil underneath. The trailer rocked with a sickening, slow-motion hitch every time the current punched against it. Linda was outside in the rain, her small frame a blurred shape in the beam of his flashlight. Her knit cap was gone, gray hair plastered to her cheeks, hands braced against the trailer's metal skin as if she could hold it steady with sheer will. Eli stood on the crooked top step, coughing between sobs, his thin shoulders jerking with the effort to breathe. Even from a distance, Frank could hear the high, whistling note in each inhalation. "Frank!" Linda's voice cracked on his name. "It's sliding." Her words were snatched away by the wind. "We'll get you out," he shouted back, closing the distance. "Inside now," he barked to Eli automatically, then caught himself. Inside wasn't safe. "Grab your inhaler," he corrected, reaching the base of the steps. Eli's eyes were huge in the flashlight glare, wet with rain and tears. He fumbled for the device in his pocket with shaking fingers. Ranger planted himself at the foot of the steps, body between the boy and the angry water, muscles taut. Frank looped one end of the tow rope around the trailer's rear support, fingers numb and clumsy, then dragged the other end to the nearest sturdy pine. He wrapped it around the trunk twice, grunting as the rope pulled tight. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was better than nothing. "Linda," he said, voice steady in a way he didn't entirely feel. "You're coming with us. One bag, if it's near the door. Nothing else." Her face crumpled for a second, old grief mixing with new fear, but she nodded. "Just him," she whispered, jerking her chin toward Eli. "That's all that matters." "Good," Frank said. It sounded like approval and an order at once. He turned to the boy. "All right, soldier," he said, the old language slipping out because it was what he knew. "You're coming with me. Arms around my neck. Hold on like a tick. You understand?" Eli gave a small, shaky nod and stepped off the trailer's top stair into Frank's arms. He was startlingly light, all bones and damp fabric and fast, uneven breaths against Frank's collarbone. Linda clutched a small duffel to her chest and grabbed the back of Frank's jacket with her free hand. "Don't let go," he told her, "no matter what." "I won't," she said, and the steel in her voice made him believe it. Ranger moved ahead of them, disappearing and reappearing in the swings of the flashlight beam. Each time he hit a low spot, The dog barked once, sharp, and Frank adjusted their path a step to the left or right, trusting that 4 good legs knew the ground better than his boots could in the dark. Water surged around their ankles, then their shins, shock cold and pushing. The rain blurred everything into streaks of gray and white. The slope up toward the cabin was slick. The thin top layer of earth turned to grease. Halfway there, the ground betrayed them. It started with a small, tearing sound, almost like fabric ripping, but deeper. Then the patch of hillside just ahead of them sagged, shuddered, and slid away in a slow, horrifying ripple. The soil under Frank's feet went soft, then gave entirely. He had just enough time to shout, "Hold on!" before they were all dropping. Him, Linda, Eli clinging like he'd been told, and even Ranger, who twisted mid-slide to stay with them as the world tilted. They hit the bottom of a shallow, freshly torn gully with a wet, heavy thud. Mud swallowed Frank's legs up to the knees, cold and gripping. His flashlight flew from his hand, the beam spinning crazily before it landed lens up in the muck, painting the scene in a ghostly upward glow. Ranger scrambled, claws scritching on exposed roots, then turned back toward them, barking, his body half blocking the current of muddy water already trickling through the new cut. "You all right?" Frank rasped, heart pounding. Eli coughed against his shoulder but nodded. Linda's grip on his jacket was so tight it almost choked him. "I got you," she gasped. "I didn't let go." "Good," he said again, with more feeling this time. He wrenched one leg free, then the other, muscles screaming. Ranger backed up carefully, letting Frank grab handfuls of fur and collar to lever himself and his burden up onto slightly firmer ground. As he did, a white tongue of lightning cracked across the sky, freezing everything in sudden, brutal daylight. In that strobe-lit instant, Frank saw it. Near the cabin, where the edge of the old foundation met the yard, the earth had sheared away, exposing a rough corner of concrete and, jutting out from beneath the porch, the rusted edge of a metal box as big as a trunk. Then, darkness slammed back down, leaving the after-image burned into his vision. Later, he told himself. First things first. With Ranger forging ahead, they clawed their way out of the gully, up the rest of the slick hill, and onto the flatter ground near the cabin. Inside, the air was damp but still, a blessed relief after the chaos outside. Frank set Eli down on the nearest chair, grabbed a blanket to throw around his narrow shoulders, and watched closely as the boy worked his inhaler, counting the measured breaths like a mantra. Linda hovered beside him, one hand on his back, her lips moving silently with each inhale, exhale. When the wheeze in Eli's chest finally softened, when his eyes lost that wild, desperate edge and his small fingers loosened around the inhaler, some of the iron band around Frank's own ribs eased. Ranger shook himself in the doorway, sending a spray of cold droplets onto the floorboards, then trotted back outside on his own, as if some unfinished task tugged at him. For a moment, Frank just stood there, watching the dog's retreating shape and listening to the drum of rain on the roof. Then he followed, grabbing the flashlight from where it still lay in the mud at the gully's edge. The beam wobbled as he made his way to the porch. Ranger was already there, pacing in a tight circle near the exposed section of foundation, nose glued to the jutting metal. Every few steps he let out a low, insistent bark, glancing back at Frank with an expression that was almost impatient. "I saw it," Frank said, voice rough. "I saw it." Together, they cleared away the loose, sodden earth. The box was heavy, its sides streaked with rust, but intact. Frank dug his fingers under one edge and heaved, grunting with the effort, until he could drag it fully into the shelter of the porch. He flipped the latches with numb hands. They were stiff, but not locked. When he lifted the lid, The smell of old paper and metal rose up, familiar now in a way that made his throat tighten. Inside, layered neatly, were envelopes, a worn bank passbook, and several thick paper packets stamped with the names of institutions he dimly remembered from his parents' careful conversations about grown-up money. Savings, bonds, things that took time and discipline to build. On top of it all lay a single folded sheet with his uncle's handwriting, older and shakier than in the basement letters. In the shaky circle of the flashlight, the words wavered a little, but their meaning did not. If you find this on a hard day, I meant it for you. Use it to keep this place if you can, or to help those who can't stand on their own if you can't. Frank exhaled slowly, the breath trembling on the way out. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Linda murmuring to Eli, the boy answering faintly, the sound of people who were still here, still alive because he'd chosen to stay. Ranger sat down beside him, pressing warmth against his leg, as if to anchor him to the wood beneath his boots instead of the mud and blood and sand of 100 other nights. All this time, Frank said quietly, thumb resting on the edge of the letter. He was trying to give me somewhere to land. The storm snarled around the cabin, wind clawing at the eaves, rain lashing the yard into a blur. But inside the small circle of light cast by his flashlight, another kind of clarity settled in. He couldn't sell this place out from under the ghosts and the living both. Not now, not with this proof that someone before him had believed it could be more than a burden. Whether the money in this box would stretch far enough to fix what needed fixing, to pay what needed paying, to keep a roof over 3 heads and 4 tired, muddy paws. That was a different question, and one he wasn't at all sure he knew how to answer. In the weeks after the storm, the mountains seemed to exhale. The hard gray band of cloud that had sat over the ridge thinned and broke apart, drifting into softer shapes. Snow retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the lower slopes washed clean. The creek, which had raged and snarled that night, settled back into its narrow bed, whispering over stones like it had never tried to swallow anything at all. The cabin and the scar of the new gully told a different story, but even those wounds looked less raw as time and hands went to work on them. Frank's days fell into a rhythm that was equal parts paperwork and hammer blows. With the metal box contents spread neatly on the kitchen table, he'd made careful calls to the county office to clear back taxes, to a bank clerk who walked him slowly through updating an account that had sat untouched for years, to a woman at a veterans organization who sounded about 30 and entirely too earnest, but who nonetheless helped him file for a small emergency grant. "You served," she said, as if that were the end of any argument about whether he was allowed to ask for help. "Let us serve a little back." He wasn't used to being on that side of the equation, but he wrote down every reference number, every promise, and tucked the uncle's letter into his wallet like a talisman. The rest of the time, he worked alongside people whose names he was still learning. The town sent what it had. A retired carpenter with shoulders like an oak stump and bifocals constantly slipping down his nose. A pair of teenage cousins, tall as saplings, who carried lumber like it weighed nothing. A widow from 3 houses down who brought coffee in a dented thermos and somehow ended up measuring and cutting insulation with more precision than any of the men. They patched the roof properly, shored up the porch posts, and framed in a small extra room that could hold 2 cots and a crate or 2 for animals when the weather turned ugly again. "Storm room," the carpenter called it. But Linda shook her head. "It's a you're not alone room," she said, wiping sawdust from her cheek. "There's a difference." Linda and Eli moved their trailer to higher ground on the back side of the property, to a spot where the land rose gently toward a stand of fir trees. It took a borrowed truck, a lot of grunting, and more than one shouted direction. But when the wheels finally settled in their new place, Linda stood with her hands on her hips and let out a breath like she'd been holding it since the night of the storm. Eli helped Frank plant the first rows in what would be the new garden. Neat lines of cold hardy greens, potatoes, and a stubborn little row of sunflowers the boy insisted on. For the birds. Ranger shadowed them all, padding along the boundary of the yard, nose cataloging every new scent. He would sprawl in the middle of the porch step when things were quiet, looking for all the world like just another old dog dozing in the sun. But the second unfamiliar tires crunched on the gravel of the drive, he was up, ears forward, body between the house and the road. Regulars, like Linda or the carpenter, earned a wag of the tail and a soft chuff. A pushy delivery driver who tried to shoulder his way past without so much as a nod got a rumbling growl that made him rethink his approach quickly. "He's a good judge of character," Linda remarked one afternoon, watching Ranger gently accept a biscuit from Eli's careful hand. "You ever notice that?" "Been relying on it for years," Frank said, scratching the dog behind one ear. "Sometimes more than my own." It was on a mild afternoon, the kind that made the air smell faintly of damp earth and pine needles warming in thin sunlight, that she came up the path. Frank was on the porch, driving the last nails into a new railing board, the jacket sleeves pushed up on his forearms. He heard the crunch of footsteps, then a woman's voice calling, "Hello, the house." In a tone that was polite but not timid, Ranger got there first, trotting to the edge of the porch and stopping, tail held at a neutral half-height, nose twitching. The woman who approached looked to be around Frank's age, maybe a year or two younger. She was of medium height, with the kind of solid, practical build that spoke of years shelving books or hauling boxes rather than gym memberships. Her silver-streaked brown hair was cut in a chin-length bob that swung a little as she walked. Laugh lines framed her mouth and eyes, and behind her wire-rimmed glasses, those eyes were an unhurried gray-green, curious but not sharp. She carried a square cardboard bakery box in both hands, the top tied with a piece of red string. "Afternoon," Frank said, setting the hammer aside and wiping his palms on his jeans out of habit. "Afternoon," she answered, stopping at the foot of the steps to give Ranger her full attention. "And hello to you, handsome." She held her hand out palm down, giving him time. Ranger lowered his nose, sniffed carefully, then, after a brief consideration, leaned in and gave her fingers one polite lick. His tail gave a soft thump. Frank blinked, surprised by the speed of the verdict. The woman smiled up at him. "Well, that's a relief," she said. "He's got a better reputation than any Yelp review in town." Her voice held a dry humor, the kind that invited someone to smile with her, not at her. "Claire Bennett," she added. "I run the used bookshop on Main, near the diner." "Frank Dawson," he replied. "This is Ranger." "An apt name," she said, glancing at the jacket, the boots, the careful way he stood, still half-angled as if ready to move toward trouble if it presented itself. "I've been meaning to come up sooner. But the roads have been mush and the shop, well, books don't shelve themselves. I brought cinnamon bread as a peace offering." She lifted the box, slightly. "I heard you and this fellow stayed up here through the storm. Linda can't stop talking about it. She and Eli, have been in twice this week. And I'm pretty sure every other sentence starts with, 'Mr. Frank and Ranger.'" Her misstep on the boy's name made her grimace lightly. "Names I remember eventually. Stories I remember right away." He felt an unexpected warmth at that, like someone had thrown another small log on an already steady fire. "You didn't have to bring anything," he said. Claire shrugged, and the motion sent a loose strand of hair across her cheek. "Maybe not," she said. But some debts aren't about money, and I bake when I don't know what else to do." She hesitated, then added, "Figured I'd see if you ever let people sit in that new storm room of yours when it's not storming. Seems a shame to waste a good table on just taxes and forms." That made him huff out a laugh. "We've got more chairs than people most days," he said. "Be glad to have you help wear them in." Inside, the cabin smelled of cut wood, coffee, and the faint, sweet trace of sawdust that never quite left, no matter how much you swept. Frank cleared a spot on the table while Claire untied the box. The cinnamon bread inside was rustic and a little lopsided, the icing a bit uneven. But when he took the first bite, it was the best thing he'd tasted in a long time. Warm and comforting, like the memory of a good campfire after a cold watch. Even Ranger got a small crust, which he accepted with solemn dignity before settling under the table, chin on his paws, listening to the cadence of their voices. In the evenings that followed, Claire came by when the shop closed early or when the weather looked like it might turn. Sometimes she brought a book under her arm, an old Western with a spine held together by tape, a worn copy of a war memoir that made Frank snort and say, "That's not how it smelled," a slim collection of letters from another era. Sometimes, on quieter nights, he brought out his uncle's letters and they read them together, taking turns over the looping handwriting. Linda and Eli would join now and then, the boy lying on his stomach near the fire. Ranger stretched out beside him like a living guardrail, while the adults talked about crops and storms and small-town gossip and, occasionally, the pieces of past they were ready to say out loud. Frank noticed, somewhere along the way, that the tightness between his shoulder blades eased faster these days once he sat down in that room. That his evenings were no longer just something to get through, but something he looked forward to. The hiss of the kettle, the creak of Claire's chair, the way Ranger's tail thumped when she came up the path, as if he decided early on that she belonged in the pack. Once, as the first snow of the new winter drifted down outside, Claire traced a finger along the edge of an old photograph of the house in better days. "You know," she said quietly, "my father used to say some buildings are just boards, but every now and then, you get one that remembers you back." Frank looked around the room, the patched walls, the new beams, the mismatched chairs, Linda's knitted blanket over one, Eli's forgotten comic book on the shelf, Ranger snoring lightly at his feet. His gaze slipped to the letter pinned above the mantel, his uncle's looping scrawl a steady presence. For the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest felt less like armor and more like roots. "Maybe people are like that too," he said. "Takes a while, but eventually you find the place that remembers you back." Claire smiled, and in the reflection of the window he caught a glimpse of himself. Older, yes, lines deeper around the eyes, hair more silver than not, but sitting easy, red and black jacket draped over the back of his chair, instead of zipped like a shield, boots crossed at the ankle, shoulders not braced for the next hit. Outside, the creek murmured softly, the mountain stood guard, and the little cabin glowed like a lantern against the early winter dark. Linda and Eli were safe on higher ground. The tax notices were replaced by receipts stamped paid, and the once broken house had become exactly what his uncle had hoped for. A place where people and animals could come in from the weather for a while and remember they weren't alone. Ranger shifted in his sleep, pressing one paw against Frank's boot as if to check he was still there. Frank reached down and rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the steady rise and fall beneath his palm, and let himself breathe in time with it. Grateful, at last, to have found that the hardest battles sometimes end not with a victory shout, but with the quiet, ordinary miracle of sitting by a warm fire in a house that feels, undeniably, like home. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't the storm stopping. It's discovering that God has already placed a shelter, a loyal dog, and a few good people along our path before the clouds even gathered. In Frank's story, there was no thunderous voice from heaven, no burning bush, just a battered cabin, an old letter, a German shepherd who refused to leave his side, and a quiet nudge in his heart that said, "Stay, protect, build." That too is how the Lord works, through ordinary days, through small acts of courage, through the stubborn love that refuses to give up on us when we're tired and afraid. If you've ever felt like Frank, old battles still echoing inside, wondering if your life still has a purpose, remember this. As long as you wake up breathing, God is not done writing your story. He can use your scars, your age, your gentle routines, even your bond with a pet, to make you a safe place for someone else. If this story touched something in you, I'd love for you to share it. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment about a moment when you felt God quietly guiding you through your own storm. Maybe through a neighbor, a pet, a stranger's kindness, or a second chance you didn't expect. Your story might be the reminder someone else is praying for tonight. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Watch over your home, your family, and the animals who share your days. May He give you the courage of Frank, the faithfulness of Ranger, and the deep peace of knowing that, no matter how late in life it feels, you still have a place in His plans.